I became the CEO of a multi-million-dollar company because my wife betrayed me. That's not the kind of story you expect to tell at 38, sitting in a corner office with a view of the city skyline stretching out like a promise I never knew I'd claim. My name's Daniel Carter, and if you'd asked me a year ago where I'd be today, I'd have said managing spreadsheets and nodding along in meetings where no one really saw me. I was good at my job, senior manager at a tech firm, but I wasn't the guy who got the big promotions. I was steady, reliable, the one who kept things running while others took the spotlight. And I was fine with that. Until I wasn't. It started with Olivia, my wife of 10 years. She's 35, the kind of woman who lights up a room without even trying, charismatic, sharp, always knowing the right thing to say. When we met, I thought I'd won some kind of cosmic lottery. She was beautiful, sure, but it was more than that. She had this energy, this way of making you feel like you were part of something bigger just by being near her. I'm not the flashy type, reserved, analytical, maybe too loyal for my own good, but with her, I felt like I'd found my balance. We built a life together, a solid one. A nice house in the suburbs, vacations once a year, a routine that felt like home. I thought we were happy. Looking back, maybe I was too comfortable. I didn't see the cracks forming, didn't notice how her laugh started to sound different, like it was meant for someone else. Olivia always had this spark, this hunger for more. She'd talk about the people she met at parties I didn't go to, the ones who owned yachts or jetted off to Paris on a whim. I'd smile and say, sounds nice, because I didn't need all that. Stability was my currency, and I thought it was hers too. Turns out, I was wrong. Here's the thing about betrayal, it doesn't announce itself with a neon sign. It creeps in, quiet and slow, until one day you're staring at a credit card statement wondering why there's a charge for a dinner at a fancy restaurant you never ate at. That's where this story begins, really. Not with some dramatic showdown, but with me, sitting at our kitchen table, a cup of coffee going cold, trying to make sense of a number on a screen. It was a Wednesday night, and Olivia had said she was out with friends. I didn't think much of it until I saw the date, the amount, the name of the place. A place we'd never been together, because it was the kind of spot where people went to be seen, not to eat. I could have brushed it off. People make mistakes, right? Maybe she'd gone with a coworker, maybe it was a treat for herself. But something about it stuck with me, like a splinter I couldn't ignore. She'd been different lately, more polished, more distant. She'd spend hours getting ready for things she used to throw on jeans for, and her phone was always buzzing, her fingers dancing across the screen with a smile I hadn't seen in a while. I'm not the jealous type, never have been. But I'm also not stupid. I started paying attention. Attention, that's what grabs you first, isn't it? The idea that a guy like me, someone who's spent his life playing by the rules, could end up on top because of something as messy as an affair. It's the why she did it, who she did it with, and how it turned my world upside down in ways I never saw coming. Interest kicks in when you realize this isn't just about heartbreak. It's about what happens when you take that pain and turn it into something else, something bigger than revenge, something they never expected. That night, I didn't confront her. I didn't even mention the charge. I just watched her when she came home, all breezy and bright, tossing her purse on the counter like nothing was off. How was your night? I asked, keeping my voice steady. Oh, just the usual, she said, not meeting my eyes. I nodded, sipped my coffee, and let the silence settle between us. She didn't notice how quiet I'd gotten, how my mind was already turning. I didn't know who he was yet, or what they'd done. But I knew something was wrong. And I was going to find out. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off after seeing that credit card charge, and it wasn't just the money, it was the way Olivia had been acting for weeks, maybe months, that started to pile up in my mind like a stack of papers I'd ignored too long. She'd always been the social one, the one who thrived at parties and dinners while I stayed home with a book or a laptop, but lately her outings had taken on a new rhythm, sudden business trips she couldn't quite explain, hours spent fussing over her appearance for events she used to shrug off, and that laugh, sharp and private, as she tapped away at her phone late into the night. I'm not the type to snoop, never have been, but I'm also not the type to let questions fester, so when a chance came to find answers, I took it, even if I wasn't sure what I'd uncover. It happened on a Friday, a week after the restaurant charge caught my eye, when I was at the office wrapping up a report nobody else seemed to care about finishing on time. The tech firm I worked for was buzzing with its usual end-of-week energy, people chatting about weekend plans, loosening ties, heading out for drinks, while I stayed behind, the reliable one, tying up loose ends. That's when Jake, a junior colleague who'd been with the company less than a year, stumbled into my office, his cheeks flushed from too many beers at the bar downstairs where the team had gone to unwind. He leaned against my doorframe, grinning like he'd just won something, and started rambling about the night, how the drinks were flowing, how the music was loud, how he'd overheard something he probably shouldn't have repeated but couldn't resist sharing because he was too far gone to filter himself. "Man, you should have come," he said, his words slurring just enough to make me look up from my screen. "Everyone's talking about Eric Whitmore, our big shot CEO, like he's some kind of rock star, you know, always got the best stories, the best suits, the best, well, everything." I nodded, half listening, because Eric was the kind of guy people talked about. 42, charismatic, the type who commanded a room without trying, the opposite of me in every way that mattered at this company. Jake took a step closer, lowering his voice like he was about to spill a secret, and that's when it hit me, he wasn't just gossiping, he was dangling something real. Heard a rumor, though, from one of the assistants, swears she saw him getting cozy with some senior manager's wife, like, all the time at those fancy events, not even hiding it. He laughed, sloppy and loud, then clapped a hand on my shoulder before staggering out, leaving me sitting there, my fingers frozen over the keyboard, my stomach twisting into a knot I couldn't untangle. A senior manager's wife, those words stuck with me, replaying over and over as I drove home that night, the city lights blurring past the windshield while I tried to convince myself it was nothing, just office chatter, the kind of nonsense people invent when they're bored or jealous. But Olivia's face kept flashing in my head, her sudden interest in those same events, the ones she'd started attending with coworkers she never named, the ones I never got invited to because I wasn't high enough on the ladder to matter. By the time I pulled into our driveway, my hands were tight on the steering wheel, and I knew I couldn't let it go, not when every detail I'd brushed off was starting to line up like pieces I'd been too trusting to connect. She was asleep when I got in, or at least pretending to be, her phone charging on the nightstand, but our shared tablet was still on the kitchen counter, glowing faintly from a notification I hadn't meant to see. We'd synced it years ago, pictures, calendars, messages, because it was easier that way, and I'd never had a reason to check hers until now, until Jake's drunken hint and that restaurant charge and her late-night giggles all crashed together into something I couldn't ignore anymore. I tapped the screen, my thumb hesitating over her messages, and there it was, Eric's name, a thread of text stretching back weeks, maybe longer, full of plans and flirty little asides she'd never sent me, not in years. "Can't wait to see you tonight," he'd written just last week, and her reply, "You make everything more fun," stared back at me, plain as day, undeniable. I stood there, the kitchen dark except for that screen, my chest tight with something I couldn't name yet, shock, sure, but also a kind of hollow ache that made me feel stupid for not seeing it sooner. Olivia, my Olivia, with Eric Whitmore, the guy who ran the company I'd poured myself into, the guy who barely knew my name despite all the times I'd fixed his messes from 3 floors below. I didn't yell, didn't wake her up, didn't even move for a long time, just let it sink in, let the pieces settle, until the hurt started to shift into something colder, something focused. "Okay," I said to myself, quiet enough that the empty room swallowed it. "Okay." I didn't know what I'd do next, not yet, but I knew I wasn't going to let this break me, not her, not him, not any of it. I didn't sleep that night after seeing those messages on the tablet, just sat in the living room with the lights off, turning everything over in my head, Olivia's texts to Eric, Jake's slurred rumor, the way she'd been slipping out of our life like it was a coat she'd outgrown. By morning, I'd made up my mind to face it head-on, not at home where she could twist things with tears or excuses, but at the source, Eric Whitmore's office, the place where he sat like some king overlooking the empire I'd helped build from the shadows. I got ready for work like it was any other Monday, shaved, put on my best suit, kissed Olivia on the forehead as she mumbled something about a meeting later, and drove to the firm with a calm I didn't feel, my hands steady on the wheel even though my pulse was racing with every mile closer to the truth I already knew. Walking through the office felt different that day, people nodded at me like always, but I noticed how their eyes slid past me, how I'd spent years being useful without ever being seen, and it fueled something inside me, a quiet fire I hadn't known I could stoke. I took the elevator to the top floor, the one reserved for executives like Eric, and when his assistant tried to stop me with a polite "he's in a meeting," I just kept walking, pushing open the heavy glass door to his corner office where he sat behind a desk twice the size of mine, the city skyline sprawling out behind him like a trophy he hadn't earned. He looked up, surprised but not rattled, his dark hair perfect, his suit tailored, his smirk already forming as he leaned back in his chair and said, "Daniel, right? What's this about?" His voice smooth, like he was doing me a favor by remembering my name. "I know about you and Olivia," I said, keeping my tone even, my hands in my pockets so he wouldn't see them clench, and for a second his smirk faltered, but then it was back, wider, like I'd just told him a joke he didn't find funny. He stood up, walked around the desk, close enough that I could smell his cologne, expensive, sharp, and leaned against the edge, crossing his arms as he looked me over, taking his time before he spoke. "You're upset, I get it, but let's not make this a thing. Marriages get messy, people move on, and frankly, you're not the type to do much about it, are you?" he said, his words dripping with a confidence that made my jaw tighten, because he wasn't just admitting it, he was dismissing me, like I was nothing, like I'd always been nothing to him even as I'd fixed his company's problems year after year. I stepped closer, not shouting, not lunging, just closing the space enough to make him shift his weight, and I said, "You think I'm weak because I don't strut around like you, but you don't even know what I've been working on, what I've built under your nose while you were too busy chasing things that weren't yours." His eyes narrowed, but before he could respond, the door swung open again, and there she was, Olivia, her face pale, her heels clicking on the hardwood as she froze halfway into the room, her purse slipping from her shoulder to the floor. "Daniel," she said, her voice high, caught off guard, and I turned to her, seeing the shock in her eyes, the way she looked from me to Eric like she hadn't expected this collision, hadn't expected me to step out of the background I'd lived in for so long. "What are you doing here?" she asked, taking a step toward me, but I held up a hand, stopping her, and turned back to Eric, who was watching us now with an amused tilt to his head, like this was entertainment he hadn't paid for. "I'm done here," I said, looking him in the eye, then glancing at her as I added, "Both of you just handed me my next opportunity, and you don't even see it yet." Olivia's mouth opened, but no words came out, and Eric chuckled, low and smug, saying, "Good luck with that, let me know how it works out," as I walked past her, past the assistant gaping in the hallway, and straight to my desk to grab my things, because I wasn't just quitting him, I was quitting the life I'd let them define for me. She followed me to the elevator, her voice shaky as she caught up, saying, "Daniel, wait, let me explain, it's not what you think, I was going to tell you, I just needed time," but I pressed the button and stared at the doors, letting her words bounce off me, because they were empty, because I'd already seen the truth in black and white on that tablet screen. "You don't need to explain," I said, stepping inside as the doors opened, "you made your choice, and now I'm making mine." She stood there, eyes wide, as the doors closed, and I felt the weight of 10 years lift off me, replaced by something new, anger, yes, but also a clarity I hadn't had before, a sense that whatever came next was mine to shape, not theirs. After walking out of Eric's office and leaving Olivia standing there by the elevator, I didn't go home that night, I couldn't, not with her voice still echoing in my ears, not with the life we'd built feeling like a house I didn't recognize anymore. Instead, I checked into a hotel downtown, a plain room with a desk and a view of the streetlights, and sat down with my laptop, pulling up the project I'd been working on for months, something innovative, a software solution that could streamline operations for companies like the one I just quit, a piece of work Eric had never bothered to notice because he was too busy preening for the board and chasing my wife. I'd kept it quiet, refining it on my own time, because I liked the challenge, not because I'd planned to use it like this, but now, staring at the files, I saw it for what it could be, my way out, my way up, my way to make them both regret underestimating me. The next morning, I called a guy I knew from college, Mark, who'd gone on to work at a rival firm, smaller than Eric's company, hungrier, always looking for an edge, and told him I had something they'd want to see, something that could put them ahead if they moved fast. He didn't ask too many questions, just said, "Come in tomorrow, bring everything," and I spent the rest of that day polishing the pitch, lining up the data, reaching out to a couple other contacts I'd made over the years who'd always said I was the guy they'd call if they needed results. By the time I walked into Mark's office, I had a plan, a prototype, and a number in my head, enough funding to get it off the ground, and when I laid it out, showing them how it could cut costs and boost efficiency, they didn't just listen, they leaned in, asked questions, offered a deal on the spot, a partnership, a stake in the company, a chance to run it if it took off. It took off faster than I'd expected. Within weeks, we had a working model, within months, we had clients, and by the end of the year, I was sitting in a boardroom of my own, not as a manager but as CEO of a firm that was pulling accounts from Eric's company like thread from a cheap suit. I didn't set out to target him specifically, not at first, but when I saw how his clients, big names he'd bragged about for years, started jumping ship because our product was better, cheaper, smarter, I didn't stop it either, just kept pushing, kept building, kept proving what I could do when I wasn't stuck in someone else's shadow. And Olivia? She didn't see it coming, not until it was too late, not until the life she'd wanted with Eric started crumbling around her. She showed up at the hotel a few weeks after I'd left. Once the news of my new role started circulating, nothing official yet, just whispers in the industry, and I let her in because I wanted to hear what she'd say, wanted to see if she'd try to rewrite what she'd done. She looked different, less polished, her hair pulled back instead of styled, her voice softer as she sat on the edge of the bed and said, "Daniel, I made a mistake, I see that now, can we talk, can we fix this?" I stood by the window, arms crossed, watching her fidget with her purse, and I could tell she'd heard about the company, about the money, about the way people were starting to say my name instead of Eric's. "You didn't think I had it in me," I said, keeping my tone flat, and she shook her head, quick, saying, "No, that's not it, I just got lost, Eric was a mistake, I want us back." But I'd seen the texts, heard the excuses, felt the weight of her choices, and I wasn't buying it, not anymore. "I don't need you to fix this," I told her, stepping closer so she'd have to look up at me. "I'm doing fine without you, better, actually, and you don't get to come back now that it's paying off." Her face crumpled, but I didn't soften, didn't reach out, just watched as she stood, grabbed her purse, and said, "You're different now," like it was an accusation. "Yeah," I said, "I am," and let her walk out, knowing she'd find out soon enough that Eric wasn't the prize she'd thought. Rumors were already spreading that he'd never seen her as more than a distraction, that he'd moved on the minute things got complicated. She'd traded our life for a fantasy, and now she was left with nothing, no luxury, no thrill, just the realization that she'd misjudged us both. By the time I signed the lease on a new place, a condo downtown, closer to the office, I heard through Mark that Eric's company was losing ground fast, that the board was questioning his decisions, that my project was the reason they couldn't keep up. Olivia called once more, left a voicemail I didn't answer, her voice shaky as she said, "I didn't know it'd turn out like this, but I deleted it, turned off the phone, and focused on the next meeting, the next client, the next step, because she wasn't my problem anymore, she was just the push I'd needed to stop settling." I'd been running the new company for almost a year when the invitation came, a corporate gala, one of those black tie events where the industry's big names gathered to clap for each other and pretend they weren't watching the competition out of the corner of their eyes, and this time, I wasn't just on the guest list, I was one of the honorees, a rising CEO they wanted to recognize for turning a small firm into a serious player. Standing in my condo, adjusting my tie in the mirror, I barely recognized myself, not because of the suit, though it fit better than anything I'd worn before, but because of the way I carried myself now, straighter, surer, like the weight of being overlooked had finally lifted. I'd spent months after leaving Eric's company riding a wave of anger, fueled by Olivia's betrayal and his arrogance, but as the business grew and the wins piled up, that fire cooled into something else, sadness for what we'd lost, then a quiet acceptance that I didn't need her to keep going, that I never had. The gala was downtown, in a hotel ballroom with chandeliers and waiters weaving through the crowd, and when I walked in, heads turned, not in a dramatic way, just enough to tell me my name meant something now, enough to make me feel the shift from the guy who'd fixed problems to the guy who made decisions. I shook hands, smiled, listened to people congratulate me on the company's latest contract, and for a while, it was just business until I saw her across the room, Olivia, standing by a table with a glass of wine in her hand, her dress elegant but her posture less certain, like she wasn't sure she belonged anymore. I hadn't seen her since that day at the hotel, hadn't answered her calls, hadn't let myself think too much about her, but there she was, watching me, and when our eyes met, she started walking over, her steps slow, deliberate, like she'd rehearsed what she'd say. "Daniel," she said when she reached me, her voice soft, almost drowned out by the chatter around us, and I nodded, keeping my expression neutral, waiting to see where she'd take this. "You look good and happy, I mean, with all this," she said, gesturing vaguely at the room, and I could tell she was nervous, her fingers tightening around the stem of her glass. "Thanks," I said, keeping it simple, because I didn't know her more than that, not after everything, and she shifted her weight, glancing away before looking back at me. "I've been thinking a lot about us, about what I did, and I know I ruined it, but seeing you here, I miss you," she said, her eyes searching mine, and for a moment, I felt that old ache, the one that had kept me up nights wondering why I hadn't been enough. I took a breath, letting the noise of the gala fade as I thought about how I'd gotten here, how her affair with Eric had shattered me at first, how I'd lain awake in that hotel room replaying every year we'd spent together, how the anger had driven me to build something new, and how, over time, the sadness had faded into a realization that I was better off without her. "You didn't ruin me," I said, my voice steady, "you pushed me into this, without you leaving, I'd still be stuck where I was, so in a way, I should thank you." Her face changed, a flicker of hope, but I wasn't done, and I stepped closer, lowering my voice so only she could hear. "But don't think that means I want you back, I don't, not after what you did, not after you chose him over us, I said, and her lips parted, like she wanted to argue, but I kept going. I'm not angry anymore, Olivia, I just don't care, and that's where we're at now. She swallowed, her eyes bright with something regret, maybe, and then she said, quiet, almost a whisper, if I'd known you had this in you, I never would have left. I looked at her, really looked at her, seeing the woman I'd loved for a decade, the one who'd traded me for a thrill that didn't last, and I felt a strange calm settle over me, no bitterness, just finality. If you never left, I never would have found it in me, I said, and her breath caught, like she hadn't expected that, like she was just now seeing what she'd set in motion. So what does this mean for us, she asked, her voice trembling, and I shook my head, stepping back. There is no us, there hasn't been since you made your choice, and I'm not going back, I said, and before she could respond, I turned, walked toward the stage where they were calling my name, leaving her standing there, stunned, as the crowd parted around me. I didn't look back, didn't need to. Whatever I'd felt for her was gone, replaced by a certainty that I'd made the right call, that the marriage was over, not because I couldn't forgive her, but because I didn't want to, because I'd found something better in its place. As I took the podium, accepting the applause, I knew this was my life now, and she wasn't part of it, not anymore. Standing on that stage at the gala, listening to the applause after they handed me the award, a glass plaque with my name etched on it, heavier than I'd expected, I realized how far I'd come since that night with the credit card statement, how the life I'd known had unraveled and rebuilt itself into something I hadn't dared imagine back when I was just a senior manager fixing other people's messes. I drove home to my condo that night, the city lights reflecting off the dashboard, and sat on the couch with a glass of water, turning the plaque over in my hands, thinking about what it meant, not just the title, not just the company, but the way I'd learned to see myself after Olivia and Eric turned my world upside down. It wasn't about them anymore, not really, it was about what I'd figured out along the way, and what I'd do with it next. Looking back, I could trace every step that brought me here, how the shock of finding those messages had hit me like a punch I didn't see coming, how the anger had pushed me out of that office and into a hotel room with a laptop and a plan, how the sadness had lingered until I'd built enough to let it go, and how acceptance had settled in, not as defeat, but as strength. I'd spent years being loyal, steady, content to keep things running while others took the credit, and I'd thought that was enough until it wasn't, until I saw how little it got me with people who didn't value it. Olivia's betrayal, Eric's arrogance, they'd forced me to stop settling, to stop waiting for someone else to notice what I could do, and in a way, I owed them for that, even if I'd never say it out loud. The new life I'd carved out wasn't just about the company, though that was a big part of it, meetings with clients who respected my ideas, a team that looked to me for direction, a schedule that kept me moving between cities and deals without time to dwell on the past. It was the condo, too, sparse but mine, with a view of the skyline I'd earned, not borrowed from someone else's office. It was the way people said my name now, Daniel Carter, not just that guy who handles things, and the way I didn't flinch anymore when I walked into a room full of suits who used to look past me. I'd learned to value myself, not because I needed to prove anything to Olivia or Eric, but because I'd seen what I could do when I stopped letting others decide my worth. Sometimes I'd hear updates about them through the industry grapevine. Eric's company had taken a hit after we siphoned off his clients, and last I heard, the board had pushed him out, replaced him with someone younger, hungrier, while he scrambled to save face with a smaller venture that wasn't gaining traction. Olivia, from what Mark told me, had moved out of our old house, sold it when the divorce papers went through, papers I'd filed a month after the hotel, no hesitation, and was living somewhere quieter now, no longer showing up at the events she used to love. I didn't feel glee about it, didn't need to, knowing they'd lost what they chased while I'd gained what I never expected was enough, a quiet satisfaction that didn't require gloating or revenge beyond what I'd already done. I thought about that last conversation at the gala a lot, her saying she wouldn't have left if she'd known, me telling her I wouldn't have found this without her leaving, and it stuck with me, not because I doubted my choice, but because it showed me how much I'd changed. Back then, I'd been a guy who played by the rules, who thought stability was the goal, but now I saw that sometimes you need a push, even a painful one, to figure out what you're capable of. You're different now, she'd said at the hotel, and she was right, I was, and I liked this version better. The one who didn't need her approval or anyone's to keep going. Sitting there with the plaque, I set it on the coffee table and leaned back, thinking about what's next, new projects, maybe expanding the company overseas, hiring more people who'd been overlooked like I was, giving them a shot I didn't get until I made my own. The story ends here, I guess, not with some big showdown or apology, but with me looking out at the city, knowing I turned betrayal into something they couldn't touch, something mine. Olivia and Eric were footnotes now, the spark that lit the fire I'd built myself, and as I finished my water and turned off the lights, I felt ready not just for tomorrow's meetings, but for whatever came after, because I'd learned the best way to move on isn't to look back, but to keep climbing.